Reading poetry is awesome.
Writing poetry is awesomer. Stick around to find out more about how to read poetry
And how to take your poetry writing from meh to magnificent.
Lorna Goodison, a Jamaican, is one of the first Caribbean women poets whose work was considered canon. That is fundamental to the region's poetry history. She was born in 1947, just 3 years after women in Jamaica were first allowed to vote in elections. She was kind of a pioneer in a wave of women who began publishing important works in the decade of the 80s, changing the Caribbean literary canon for good. Goodison's poetry talks a lot about Jamaica's people, landscape, and history. Sometimes she uses humor and irony to make serious points. Her poem, The Woman Speaks to the Man Who Has Employed Her Son, is a grim piece of work, but it's also full of ironic humor. It describes how a mom talks to the gangster who has seduced her one little piece of boy child.
Now he tells her he's working for you. That you value him so much, you give him one whole submachine gun for him alone.
Goodison's first book of poems, Tamarind Season, came out in 1980. Since then, she's published more than a dozen other collections and won huge international and regional prizes for her writing. Lorna Goodison was Jamaica's first female poet laureate, and today she continues to write poetry, fiction, and non-fiction. Poetic language can be really different from ordinary speech. That's the beauty of poetry. And that's also one of the reasons poetry might be pretty confusing. For example, the words of a poem may say one thing and mean something else. In Elmer Mitchell's poem, A Stone's Throw, the narrator tells the biblical story of the stoning of Mary Magdalene.
A decent looking woman, you'd have said. They often are. Beautiful, but dead scared. And not the first time by any means she'd felt men's hands greedy over her body. But ours were virtuous. Of course.
Mary was accused of sin, and the narrator is one of the judgy men who want to stone her to death. The narrator is mean, self-righteous, and sarcastic. The whole poem is set up to show what a fool he is, because he's no better than Mary. He's a sinner too. By saying one thing, the poem means the opposite. It's a literary device called irony. Irony is when the thing that happens is the opposite of what you'd expect. If it's the hottest day in the history of hot days, and you're wearing a sweater for the first time ever, that's irony. Irony applies to situations. When you say one thing to mean the opposite, that's called sarcasm. A Stone's Throw uses both. Don't confuse either of them with satire, which uses irony or humor or exaggeration to make a point about a ridiculous or hypocritical situation. In Trinidad and Tobago Carnival, plenty old mask characters are satirical. Now, back to our regular programming. Poetry often uses imagery, comparison, and other poetic devices to help the reader understand the human condition through painting a picture with language. But sometimes you read a poem and get a vibe without knowing exactly what the poem means. Believe it or not, that's perfectly okay.
It is a test that genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thanks, great 20th century poet T.S. Eliot. That's sarcasm, by the way. Actually, he's not wrong. Poetry communicates through making you feel all the things. And those feels don't come out of nowhere. The poet has chosen imagery and language pictures and atmospheric words to build that emotion in the reader. Let's take a look at the poem Once Upon a Time by Gabriel Lucara. This poem sounds like a father telling his son about how things used to be.
There was a time indeed. They used to shake hands with their hearts. But that's gone, son. Now they shake hands without hearts, while their left hands search my empty pockets.
It's straightforward, right? Except that you don't literally shake hands with your heart. That would be messy. When a poet mentions heart, it could mean the actual muscle in your chest, but it's also likely to mean emotion, love, passion, or honesty. You have to use the context to figure out the deeper meaning. The narrator sounds really bummy, right? In this case, heart means love. But who is they? Whoever they aren't your real friends. Because real friends love you. They don't try to rob you. Pay attention to the title. This poem is called Once Upon a Time. Like a fairy tale? No. By choosing that title, the poet tells us that since it's been so long since the narrator had real friends, it might as well be a fairy tale. We also think about fairy tales as innocent, a symbol from our childhood. That's why, by the end of the poem, the narrator calls back to his own childhood, his lost innocence, which he can see in his son. When you're reading a poem, look for symbols. In Once Upon a Time, there are plenty. All those hearts and laughs and teeth and such mean much more than just those nouns. When we read about their ice block cold eyes, we know that this is a case of all skin teeth they laugh. Poetry speaks to the mind, but it also speaks to the gut with imagery. When you're reading a poem, you can find clues to its meaning in its form and poetic structure. What kind of poem is it? Is it long and skinny like a snake? Is it in neat, even stanzas? Is it free verse or is there a structure? Does it rhyme a lot or not at all? All those different facets prepare you to experience the poem before you really understand how they add up. The poems, A Stone's Throw, Once Upon a Time, and The Woman Speaks to the Man Who Has Employed Her Son all have first-person narrators, telling their own sides of complicated stories. Write a poem in which the narrator gives their perspective of some difficult or controversial situation. You can write it in any form or style you like. Try it.